On the most important day of my son's life, something happened that shattered everything I thought I knew about family, and I can never unsee it. On my son's wedding day, in front of nearly 200 guests, my daughter-in-law shoved my wife into a muddy puddle, like it was some kind of joke. The music was still playing, cameras, flashing laughter filling the air, until that single moment broke everything. My wife, dressed in the white silk gown she had spent months choosing with so much care, fell hard. I heard the fabric tear before I even saw her hit the ground. Mud spread across the dress instantly, staining what was meant to be one of her proudest moments. And then, my daughter-in-law laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an apology, a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the silence like a blade. She even said something cruel loud enough for people nearby to hear, as if humiliating my wife was part of the celebration. I stood there frozen, trying to process what had just happened. But what hurt even more was my son. He was only a few steps away. He saw everything. He heard everything. And instead of rushing forward to help his own mother, he turned his back, pretending nothing had happened. Around us, people looked away, whispered, adjusted their smiles. No one stepped in. No one spoke up. In that moment, I realized something far worse than the fall itself. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. And somehow, everyone else already understood it except us. At first, it looked like a simple accident, just a slip on wet ground after the rain. That's what people wanted to believe. That's what they whispered to each other, to keep the celebration intact. But I stood there long enough to see what others chose to ignore. The way my daughter-in-law positioned herself right behind my wife. The slight push that didn't look like much, but came with perfect timing. The way her foot pressed down on the hem of the dress, just a second too long. And then that laugh, it didn't belong to someone surprised. It belonged to someone satisfied. In that moment, everything slowed down in my mind. I stopped hearing the music, the chatter, even the cameras clicking. All I could see was intention. This wasn't carelessness. It was control. It was deliberate. A public display designed to humiliate, to lower, to send a message without ever having to say it directly. And what terrified me the most wasn't just what she did, it was how easily everyone accepted it. No outrage, no confrontation, just silence, wrapped in polite smiles. That kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. It only exists when something has already been understood by everyone in the room. Except me. Except my wife. We were the only ones still thinking this was a family. That realization hit harder than anything else that day. Because once you see intention behind cruelty, you can't pretend it was ever an accident again. And in that moment, I knew. This was only the beginning. For a brief second, after my wife hit the ground, the entire garden seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, cameras paused, and a strange silence settled over the crowd. You would expect someone, anyone, to rush forward to offer a hand, to say something. But that moment passed, and no one moved. Instead, people looked at each other unsure, then quickly looked away. A few forced out awkward laughs, as if trying to match the tone my daughter-in-law had already set. Someone muttered that the ground was slippery after the rain. Another said older people needed to be more careful. Their words floated around, light, dismissive, almost rehearsed. Not one person mentioned the push. Not one person repeated the cruel words that had just been said. It was as if an invisible agreement had formed in seconds to pretend nothing had happened. I watched faces carefully. Smiles returned, conversations resumed, and the music picked back up like nothing had been interrupted. And in that moment, I understood something deeply unsettling. Silence can be louder than any insult. Because silence means permission. It means acceptance. It means people have already decided what matters and what doesn't. My wife was still struggling to stand, her dress heavy, with mud, her hands trembling slightly. And yet, to everyone else, the event had already moved on. That was when I realized we weren't just ignored. We had been quietly erased from importance, right in front of everyone. Out of everyone standing in that garden, there was only one person whose reaction truly mattered to me, my son. Not the guests, not the whispers, not even the cruel laughter that still echoed in my ears. Him, because in that moment, he wasn't just a groom, he was still a son. And I believed even for a second that instinct would take over, that he would step forward, reach out, and help his own mother up from the mud, without hesitation. but he didn't. He stood just a few steps away, close enough to see every detail, close enough to hear every word that was said. I watched his face carefully searching for something: shock, anger, even confusion. Anything that showed he understood what had just happened. Instead, he adjusted the cuff of his suit, a small controlled movement like he was fixing something out of place. Then he turned his head, slightly avoiding direct eye contact, and focused on the photographer who was still trying to organize people for the next shot. It was subtle. So subtle that most people wouldn't notice. But I did. Because I wasn't looking at a crowd, I was looking at my son choosing a side. In that instant, something inside me shifted. Not broken, not shattered, just quietly rearranged. I realized this wasn't hesitation. It wasn't confusion. It was a decision. He had weighed the moment and decided that stepping forward would create discomfort, would draw attention, would disturb the image of perfection being carefully maintained. And so he chose the easier path: silence, the kind of silence that protects appearances, not people. I thought back to all the years we had spent, raising him, teaching him what respect meant, what family meant. Those lessons didn't disappear. They were simply set aside. Because in that moment, protecting his new life mattered more than defending the people who gave him his first one. And what hurt the most wasn't just that he didn't help, it was that he made it look natural, effortless, as if turning away from his own mother was something he had already practiced in his mind long before this day ever came. That was when I understood the truth I had been avoiding. This was no longer about a daughter-in-law crossing a line. This was about a son who allowed it to happen, and in doing so, silently agreed with it. And once a person shows you that kind of choice, you can never look at them the same way again. When we stepped into the main hall, everything felt different, even though nothing had visibly changed. The music was louder, the lights warmer, the smell of food filled the air as if the celebration had never been interrupted. But for me, something had shifted completely. It wasn't just what had happened outside in the garden. It was what followed, the quiet, calculated way we were placed. Our table was at the far end of the hall, near the service door, where staff moved in and out carrying trays. It was small, slightly out of line with the rest, almost as if it had been added at the last minute. From where we sat, we couldn't see the stage clearly. We were out of the main camera angles, out of the center, out of importance. I looked around at the other tables. Large, perfectly arranged, filled with laughter and conversation, especially on the bride's side. Her family sat close to the front near the stage, where every moment would be captured and remembered. Glasses were raised, jokes were shared, and voices carried easily across the room. Meanwhile, at our table, silence felt heavier than the air itself. My wife sat down slowly, her posture straight, her hands resting quietly in her lap like she was trying to hold everything together. The replacement dress she wore was simple, nothing like the one she had chosen so carefully before. I noticed her fingers still slightly red, even though the mud had been cleaned away. And still no one came over. No one asked if she was okay. Not a single person from my son's new family acknowledged what had happened. It was as if we had already been placed into a different category, present but not included. I listened as conversations drifted from nearby tables. They spoke about business, about money, about opportunities. I even caught fragments of numbers being mentioned casually, like they were discussing deals, not a marriage. There was laughter, but it didn't feel warm. It felt transactional, measured. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't just about disrespect. This was about positioning, about showing everyone without saying it directly exactly where we belonged in this new arrangement. We weren't honored guests. We weren't central figures. We were background, necessary but not valued, visible but not important. And the more I sat there, the more I realized this had been planned long before that moment in the garden. The fall hadn't changed anything. It had only revealed what was already in place. I thought the humiliation was the worst part, until I heard what they were planning behind a closed door. I didn't go looking for answers that night. I only stepped away from the table because the air felt too heavy to breathe. The noise inside the hall, laughter, clinking glasses, polite conversations pressed against me, like something artificial, something I no longer belonged to. I walked down the hallway behind the main room where the lights were dimmer, and the noise faded into a distant echo. That was when I passed by a half-closed door. I wasn't trying to listen, I had no intention of overhearing anything, but then I heard my name. And once you hear your own name spoken, in a tone that doesn't belong to you, you stop. Tiffany's voice came first, calm, confident, not the voice of someone embarrassed by what had happened in the garden. She spoke about the future as if it were already secured. She mentioned assets ownership arrangements that would soon be finalized. Then another voice joined older measured. I assumed it was her father. He talked about a life insurance policy, mentioning a sum of $2 million, as if it were something already expected, not hypothetical. The way he said it made it sound less like planning and more like timing. Then came words about property, about transferring names, to simplify control, about managing business obligations, quickly before anything could complicate the process. Every sentence was polite, controlled, but underneath it all there was something unmistakable: anticipation. And then, my son spoke. His voice was quieter, slightly cautious, but there was no resistance in it. He didn't question what was being said. He didn't object. Instead, he agreed in a way that sounded almost casual. He said I was getting older, that I sometimes forgot things, that letting him take over management would be safer. Safer. He even let out a small laugh, like he was softening the weight of his words. In that moment, something inside me became perfectly clear. The fall in the garden wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. It was a signal, a test maybe, a way to establish a dynamic where respect could be removed without consequence. And now, standing outside that door, I understood the larger picture. To them, I wasn't a father. I wasn't even a person to consider emotionally. I was a position, a source, a number that needed to be transferred, controlled, eventually, replaced. I didn't feel anger the way I thought I would. There was no rush of heat, no urge to confront. What I felt instead was clarity, sharp, cold, undeniable. Because once intention reveals itself in both action and conversation, there is no room left for doubt. I stepped away from the door quietly, without making a sound. I didn't need to hear more. I had already heard enough to understand everything. That night I made a decision that no one could see, but one that would change everything. I didn't walk back into that hall with anger. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply sat down beside my wife, held my composure, and let the silence settle in. Because I understood something very clearly. Reacting in that moment would only give them control over the narrative. So instead, I chose patience. But not the kind of patience that waits helplessly, the kind that prepares. When we got home, I didn't speak much. My wife apologized, softly blaming herself for causing trouble on our son's big day. That hurt more than anything. I reassured her, but I didn't explain what I had heard behind that door. Not yet. Some truths, if revealed too early, only deepen the wound. That night, while the house was quiet, I sat at my desk and opened files I hadn't touched in years. Financial records, property documents, agreements that had once been written with trust, now read with clarity. I didn't rush. Every page mattered. Every detail had weight. The next morning, I began quietly shifting things. I canceled a financial arrangement I had been preparing for months, a fund meant to support my son's future home. There was no confrontation, just a simple confirmation message, no explanation attached. I contacted an appraiser I trusted, asked him to evaluate my assets again, not because I wanted to sell, but because I needed precision. I reviewed every clause with my lawyer, every condition tied to past support. And one by one I saw how easily trust can be turned into leverage if left unguarded. Days passed and I said nothing. No calls, no messages. That silence stretched longer than they expected. I knew it would, because people who rely on your presence always notice when it disappears. My son eventually called. His tone was light, casual, as if nothing had happened. I answered briefly, carefully. I didn't give him conflict. I gave him uncertainty. And uncertainty is far harder to face. Meanwhile, my wife continued, visiting them, helping, cleaning, trying to maintain a sense of connection. But each time she returned, I saw it in her eyes: fatigue, quiet disappointment, a growing realization. I didn't question her. I simply listened and remembered everything. Because I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. Quietly, precisely, and when someone mistakes your silence for weakness, they rarely see what's being built behind it. So, tell me this, if you were in my place, would you have spoken up immediately? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear how you would handle it. What happened at the wedding was public, sharp, impossible to ignore. But what followed was quieter, slower, and somehow even more disturbing. In the days after, my wife continued going back to their apartment. Not because she was asked kindly, but because she believed it was her responsibility to keep peace, to support our son, to prove that family still meant something. At first, nothing seemed obviously wrong. She told me small things, simple requests, helping organize, cleaning a little here and there. But the details began to repeat. And repetition reveals patterns. She was asked to wipe the same table again because it wasn't done properly. Then again, and again. She was told to rearrange items that had already been placed. She was corrected in tone that sounded polite on the surface, but carried something colder underneath. Not once, not twice, but over and over until the message became clear, without needing to be spoken directly. She wasn't there as family. She was there to serve. My son was present during some of these moments, sitting nearby, watching, silent, just like in the garden. He didn't join in, but he didn't stop it either. And sometimes, doing nothing says more than any action. Each time my wife came home, she said less. Her voice grew softer, her movement slower, like she was carrying something heavier than just physical exhaustion. I didn't push her to speak. I didn't interrupt what she needed to process, but I observed everything. The way she avoided eye contact when mentioning Tiffany's name. The way her hands lingered under warm water longer than necessary, as if trying to wash something deeper than dirt. That was when I knew endurance alone was no longer protection. It was exposure. I made a decision, not out of anger but out of necessity. I gave her a small recording device and explained why. Not to spy, not to create conflict, but to preserve truth. Because when disrespect hides behind polite words, it needs to be seen clearly to be understood. She didn't argue. She didn't question. She simply nodded, quietly accepting that something had shifted. Over the next days, the recordings came back filled with exactly what I expected. No shouting, no dramatic scenes, just steady repeated patterns of control, correction, and quiet humiliation. Enough to remove all doubt. Enough to reveal character without exaggeration. And in that calm accumulation of evidence, I found something powerful. Not revenge, not anger, but certainty. Because once truth is documented, it no longer depends on opinion. It stands on its own. The housewarming party was exactly what I expected. Polished, carefully staged, filled with people who believed they were witnessing success. Warm lights, controlled laughter, confident conversations drifting across the room like rehearsed lines. We arrived on time. Not early, not late. Just enough to step into the moment without drawing attention too quickly. My wife walked beside me, calm, composed, her presence, quieter than before, but stronger in a way that didn't need to be spoken. No one greeted us immediately. That didn't surprise me. We stood near the edge of the room observing. Tiffany moved through the crowd, like it was her stage, accepting compliments, telling stories about the apartment, as if it had always been hers. I listened carefully. The way she spoke about ownership, about plans, about what would come next. It wasn't hope. It was assumption. Then the doorbell rang. A small sound, but it shifted the rhythm of the room. The assistant opened the door, and 3 individuals stepped inside, 2 men in formal suits and a woman carrying a folder. Their presence didn't belong to the celebration. It belonged to something else. Something precise. I took a step forward. Not rushed, not hesitant, just exactly when it needed to happen. I said they were there at my request. The room quieted slowly at first, then completely. Conversation stopped one by one, attention pulling toward a single point. The woman opened the folder and spoke clearly. She announced the cancellation of the apartment purchase under activated contractual clauses. The property, she explained, had been legally transferred into a charitable trust dedicated to abandoned elderly individuals following the directive of the original benefactor. No raised voice, no emotion, just facts. Tiffany reacted instantly. Her tone sharpened, asking about rights, about agreements, about how this could be possible. The response she received was calm, structured, undeniable. Every document was in place. Every condition had been met. There was no argument left to make. Julian looked at me then. Confusion, frustration, something deeper behind his eyes. He asked why I would do this. Why here? Why now? I met his gaze and answered simply. Because this was the place where certainty had been assumed. And truth, when it needs to be heard, should be spoken where it cannot be ignored. Then I signaled to my lawyer. A short recording played. Not long, just enough. The sound of the fall, the laughter, the words that followed. Silence filled the room in a way no music could cover. Faces changed, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to shift understanding. I didn't need to say much after that. I only stated one thing. Money can build event spaces, appearances, but it cannot create respect where it does not exist. And that is why I chose to place it where it would be valued, not assumed. Tiffany stepped back, her expression losing its control. Julian didn't speak again, and I didn't wait for them to. I turned to my wife, took her hand, and we walked out. No rush, no hesitation, just clarity, because the moment had already said everything that needed to be said. I didn't lose my family that day. I finally understood it, and that changed everything. After that night, I didn't go back. Not to the apartment, not to the conversations, not to the version of family that had quietly rewritten itself without us. I didn't wait for explanations either, because some actions speak so clearly that words only dilute them. In the days that followed, the silence continued, but this time it wasn't theirs, it was mine. My son called a few times, his voice shifting with each attempt. First confusion, then urgency, then something that sounded almost like regret. He spoke about misunderstandings, about pressure, about things going too far. I listened calmly, without interrupting, and when he finished, I didn't raise my voice. I simply told him that what happened wasn't built in a single day, and because of that, it couldn't be undone in a single conversation. That was the truth, not harsh, not emotional, just final. Tiffany's side moved faster. They didn't reach out to me directly. They contacted my lawyer, asking about alternatives, reversals, adjustments. But the answer remained unchanged. Everything had been set into motion properly, legally, completely. There was nothing left to negotiate. And once the money was no longer where they expected it to be, their interest faded just as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't celebrate that. I didn't feel satisfaction, because what had been revealed wasn't something I wanted to be right about. It was simply something I could no longer ignore. As for my wife and me, we made a different choice. We sold the old house, not out of necessity, but out of clarity. We no longer needed to hold on to spaces filled with expectations that were never truly ours. We kept what mattered, the rest we let go. Slowly, without pressure, we began to live differently. We traveled not far, not extravagantly, but freely. We woke up without schedules, walked without urgency, spoke without weight behind our words. And for the first time in a long time, I saw something return to my wife's eyes: peace, not the kind that comes from comfort, but the kind that comes from release. Months later, I received a short message from my son. No requests, no explanations, just a single line saying he understood. I read it, then set the phone aside. Not out of anger, but because some distances need time before they can be measured again. And as I sat there watching the sun go down beside the woman who had stood quietly through everything, I realized something simple but powerful. Letting go isn't failure. Sometimes it's the only way to protect what still deserves to remain whole. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or quietly pushed aside, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below, because sometimes the strongest voice is the one that speaks after silence.